Hello everybody, John Fenn here with supernaturalhousechurch.org, once again talking about the discipleship process. Today talking about Paul's self-image problem. People may not have realized that Paul had to deal with some self-image things, but he bears his heart in three separate places, at least, that we know about him. Now, everybody probably struggles with self-image and self-confidence one time or another. I know when my parents split up, we four kids were thinking, if we even said if we weren't alive, our parents would still be together. You know, if we weren't here, my parents would still be together. Well, do you know Paul felt similarly? He shares in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in the first 10 verses, about how he was, as he says, born out of due time. In fact, starting in verses 6, 7, 8, and 9, he talks about how the risen Lord was seen by Peter and James and John and all the others. And then he says this, he says, last of all, he was seen by me also. Of course, Paul met the Lord on the way to Damascus when the Lord appeared to him, when Paul wanted to spread, the then Saul of Tarsus wanted to spread his persecution to Damascus, and the Lord stopped him and revealed himself to him. And saved him for a higher call. And so, but Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, we've seen by everybody else, even 500, he said more than 500 people saw him at once. The greater part of them are still alive to this day. That's some 20 years later. And so Paul is surrounded by all these people who have real life stories of Jesus. And he says of himself, he says, I was like one who was born out of due time. Now, the word due time or born out of due time is an interesting Greek word. It's the Greek word ektroma, E-K-T-R-O-M-A, ektroma. Now, ektroma is the Greek word for abortion or miscarriage. And it was originally used in the Roman Senate when a bill was proposed, and then that we would say today the bill died in committee, or the bill was thrown out, or the bill stayed in committee. One or the other died in committee before reaching the Roman Senate floor to be voted on to be made law. Paul used the term, my life was an ektroma. It was as if I was an ektroma. In other words, Paul is saying, everybody else saw Jesus. Where was I? I was like an aborted baby. I was like a miscarriage. I'm completely out of step with the times. I mean, can you imagine how he felt? I mean, he's persecuting the church. He was standing there when Stephen died. He was one of the accessories, at least, to his murder, if not the instigator. In Acts chapter 7, the end of Acts 7 tells us that he was standing by holding the coats of those who were throwing stones. And then he's surrounded by people who knew Jesus, walked with Jesus, Peter and John and Matthew and all these guys. And then he says 500 people or more saw him at once after his resurrection. He was nowhere around. We don't know if Paul was off in Tarsus, his hometown. We don't know what he was doing, but he wasn't there. So he uses the term ektroma, meaning my life was like an abortion. I was miscarried. And I'm telling you, that's what a lot of people feel like. They feel like they're out of step. I know I was 25 years in the traditional church and I never felt like I belonged because I wouldn't play games. I wasn't territorial. I wasn't political. I was searching for and trying to do relationship-based faith within that structure, and the structure just didn't contribute to the relationships. The very things it says it supports are the very things oftentimes it destroys, unfortunately. But anyway, back to the subject. So Paul is struggling with this. He says, my life was like an abortion. I was misstepped. I was out of time in history. And he shares a little bit more of his struggles of how he deals with this in Galatians chapter 1 and verses 15 and 16. And he tells the Galatians, he says that it pleased God to separate me from my mother's womb. This is Galatians 1 verses 15 and 16. It pleased God to separate me from my mother's womb, to reveal his higher purpose in me. And Paul's trying to figure this out. It's like, how could the Lord let me live and I'd be born in the wrong time? So I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. All these things happened all around me. And he said, and yet at the same time, I'm here, I'm alive. For some reason, it pleased God that I was born. See, this is the way children in divorced homes feel. This is when we lose someone close. This is when we get fired, when there's a scandal in our church, whatever the case is. You're thinking, man, I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time, or what's wrong with me that this keeps happening to me, or whatever. And we deal with the self-image. We're going like, I just feel like my life could have been, like Paul, he was saying, I feel like I could have been aborted. I should have been a miscarriage because I missed the ministry of Jesus. You ever feel like that sometimes? I mean, deep down you think, man, there are times, when we were kids and after mom and dad left especially, I'm thinking, man, I wish I wasn't even born. And people struggle with that. And that was Paul's feelings, his ectroma. He feels like his life in 1 Corinthians 15:8 and 9 and 10, he says, I feel like I was born out of due time in the English. It just doesn't do it justice. It feels like my life should have been aborted, is what he was saying. But then he reveals, okay, now how he's thinking through this. Okay, somehow it pleased God that I was born alive. And then he concludes to reveal his son in me and call me by his grace. So no matter what you've been through, no matter what you've done in life, it still pleased God to separate you from your mother's womb, to use Paul's words in Galatians 1:15-16. That he saw your life on down the time frame. And Paul told Timothy when he's writing a personal letter in 1 Timothy chapter 1, in fact, it's one of the first few verses in verse 16. I mean, he's 16 verses into it. And he says this, I persecuted the church. He said, I'm not even worthy to be called an apostle. He said, I'm not worthy, but the Lord chose to show his long suffering by being patient with me, long suffering with me, as a pattern for those who would believe after me. So what Paul concluded here was that he didn't understand why he was born out of due time, why he shouldn't have been an aborted baby or a miscarried baby. He didn't understand why he was born just half a step behind everybody. Why wasn't he there at the time that Jesus' ministry was going on? He didn't understand any of that, but he said, okay, it still pleased God that I was in fact born, and he did reveal Christ to me, so I am saved. And then he told Timothy, he says, my life is a pattern. He said, he saved me and he proved his long suffering as a pattern to those who would believe after me. This is in 1 Timothy 1:16. Now, the word pattern is pretty interesting. Usually Paul uses the simple word pattern, but he actually used the word hypotyposis. Hypo is over and above, and typosis is where we get the word type. In fact, the word hypotyposis was actually talked about a master plan, a master architectural plan, or a sketch or a drawing. And Paul is saying the Lord chose to use long suffering to me, to separate me, knowing what I would do. He still wanted me born alive in this world, even though he knew I was going to persecute the church, even though he was going to do all those sinful things and everything else. He still did it so that my life could be a pattern. The love that he showed me is a pattern to those who would come after. They can look at the sketchbook of my life, at the plans of my life, and then they can take inspiration. And we know that he concluded this further because if we go back to my original text of 1 Corinthians 15:10, he came to this conclusion. He said, even though I feel like I should have been aborted or miscarried baby, or I was born a half a step out of due time, the proper timing, he says, by God's grace, I am what I am. See, the struggle that everybody has to come to conclusion, to draw the conclusion, is this: by God's grace, I am what I am. I've been through what I've been through. I've learned what I've learned. I'm still making mistakes, but by God's grace, I am what I am. Paul would say, he'd go on in this verse in 1 Corinthians 15:10, and he goes on to say, he said, the grace of God that was given to me has not been in vain. He said, in fact, I worked harder than any other apostle. He said, but it really wasn't me working, it was God's grace in me working. And that's the conclusion we all have to draw when we're struggling with self-image and our sense of place in the world and our purpose in the world. We have to noodle it through, as we would say. We have to think it through, that, okay, you are born, the Lord saw fit to cause you to be born, that you grew up, that you did all the things that you did, and you were born again, and maybe you did some of those things after you were born again. But he says this is the turning point. Use your life as an example of God's grace. What Paul recognized is it wasn't me working so hard, it was God's grace in me that I'm compelled from within. You see, Paul would later write in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 17, 18, and 19. He says this, he says, I'm praying, and this is my prayer for you, that you would be strengthened by God's Spirit in your inner man, so that you can know the height, depth, breadth, and length of the love of Christ, which is beyond knowledge. He says, if you'll know the agape love, if you can know the agape love of God, the unconditional love of God, you can comprehend things that are beyond knowledge. And see, when we don't love ourselves, when we struggle within ourselves and we hold on to those things, then we can't latch on to the things of God. The truth is, you can't believe the truth if you continue to hold on to the lie. It's all or nothing. You can't be unstable, double-minded in this. And so many people want the Lord to heal their self-image while they still want to hold on to the things that Paul was talking about here. Born out of due time. Why wasn't I aborted? Why wasn't I miscarried? Why was I born at the wrong time in that household to grow up in that way? Or whatever the case is. And there comes a point you just have to let loose of that and say, Father, I'm running to you full speed. What my recommendation is that you go through the book of Ephesians to start with, and everywhere it says God, insert the word Father, because that's who Paul's writing about, God the Father. Ephesians 1:3, God the Father blessed us with all spiritual blessings in the heavenly places. What he says in Ephesians 3, that God the Father would strengthen you by his Spirit so that you can comprehend the love that he has for you that is beyond knowledge, to know it down inside. All right, so let's go back to that. Let's close with that and realize once again that Paul had to come to a conclusion. He had to come to the end of himself, and he said, but God, by God's grace, I am what I am. And then he looked forward and said, my life is going to be a pattern for others. My life is going to be an example for others, and that I'm going to help people know the love of Christ that is beyond knowing. So I hope this has been a blessing to you today. God bless. See you next week.